This week, we will be exploring unsolved mysteries that range from this insane phenomenon where all over Europe for thousands of years, entire communities burnt down their houses and buildings for reasons completely unknown, to one of the most mysterious and intriguing maritime disappearances ever witnessed in North America, to this super old mystery of these giant metal cauldrons from seemingly thousands of years ago from unknown sources. They have been seen less and less over the years. Recent searches for them have turned up almost nothing, and one of the last eyewitnesses that say they actually saw these died a few years back. But it is a fascinating one to dive into, and we will explore that as well as many other mysteries. So grab a drink. My choice today is coffee with cream, and join me as we explore the unsolved mysteries Iceberg. The Atlanta Ripper was a killer who murdered at least 15 people, at least, in Atlanta between 1909 and 1914. These were all women, and after the first few killings, police started to kind of link them together. And eventually, after the 8th woman was found, they, put 2 and 2 together and realized that they had a serial killer on their hands. All of the victims were black women in their 20s, and so, obviously, black women in their 20s were terrified, especially if they lived or worked in and around the areas that the other bodies were found in. They wouldn't stay out at night, they wouldn't walk, especially not alone, and a lot of them in the local area just refused to go to work whatsoever. And honestly, I can't really blame them. The Ripper seemed to target fairly attractive women who had some semblance of an education, but the reason for the killings in the first place, and for why he targeted this specific demographic of people, was never figured out. They were mostly all killed with a knife and or sharp object, and the killer he was called the Ripper. So you can imagine what he did to the victims with the knife, both before, during, and after he killed them. It was horrific, it was violent, it was gruesome, and it seemed like these deaths weren't just the result of wanting to kill, but also a result of this person wanting to destroy and cause as much pain and damage as possible. And one of the daughters of one of the victims, who was actually present during an attack of her mother, witnessed everything and said that she saw the attacker and described him as a powerfully built, well-dressed, large black man. And partly based on this description, they were able to bring in a few suspects who were questioned, investigated, etc., and then eventually let go. And sadly, tragically, this case was never solved, and the Ripper was never caught. Bruhathkayosaurus. So this was a potential new genus of sauropod, which was found in India in 1978. Obviously, the dinosaur wasn't found, just the fossils, and they have disappointingly actually since dissolved and or disintegrated. So yeah, but if this dinosaur were to exist, just based on these now non-existent fossils, it might very well have been the largest land animal to ever exist. In comparison, the Argentinosaurus is thought to have reached around 35 meters in length, or 115 feet, as I know a lot of you appreciate the unit conversion, and between 65 and 100 tons, which is flippin' huge. But the Bruhathkayosaurus is thought to have been upwards of 47 meters, or 154 feet in length, and up to 220 tons, which is just insane. This would have been both longer and heavier than the largest blue whale to ever exist, which sat at around 30 meters, 98 feet in length, and around 200 tons. And bear in mind, this dinosaur would have been on land, which makes it at least relatively even heavier. So yeah, this was a huge, giant dinosaur, or rather potential dinosaur, as we never had the full skeleton for it, and the stuff that we, did have is now disintegrated, but hopefully more will turn up. But until then, this potentially world's largest creature will remain a bit of a mystery. And our next mystery is why you aren't subscribed. I mean, what the heck, guys? Join the family, it takes a second, it's free, and you get us one step closer to our goal of 100 billion subscribers. So welcome aboard. Buridan's ass, or Buridan's donkey, is a paradox, a thought experiment, and it's the idea that you have a donkey that is both equally thirsty and equally hungry, and it is placed exactly in between a bucket of water and a stack of hay. And this is sometimes represented as a donkey, sometimes as a man, and sometimes instead of food and water, there are two identical collections of food on either side. So say a man in the middle with two pizzas either side, and he is starving, but because he can't make a decision between the two different pizzas, I mean, I say different, they are identical if you can imagine. So it doesn't matter whatsoever which pizza you pick, as they are both exactly the same, but this indecision leads to the person not deciding either way, and then they end up starving to death. This is a interesting paradox, and I think we actually experience it ourselves more often than we might think. We can't decide between two or more different restaurants, so we just don't go out to eat. We can't decide which show to watch, so we just don't end up watching anything. And if we're starting a new project or company, we can't decide what to name the company, we can't decide what color the logo should be, and this chronic indecision just leads to us not creating anything whatsoever. So, as I said, it's an interesting paradox and an interesting visualization of that paradox. The burnt house horizon. So this one was absolutely fascinating to look into. It refers to this huge area in southeastern Europe in which archaeologists have found evidence for mass house burning. Like, it's really strange. This was all the way back in 6500 BC up until around 2000 BC. So for like 4,000 years, give or take. The houses were burnt, even entire villages and communities, like mass violent burning. So much so that the clay they used to build their houses ended up cooking essentially into like ceramic, almost as if you put the whole thing in a kiln. And as well as this, it would almost completely destroy the house, and it would scorch the rubble and rock. And these burnings would occur, as I said, every roughly 70 to 80 years for roughly 4,000 plus years over this entire huge area. Now that is what happened, but why happened is another question entirely. The main two splits in thought about why it happened generally comes from whether you believe the fires were accidentally started or whether they were deliberately started. There's evidence for both, of course, so it's not exactly a super obvious cut and dry issue. On one hand, a bunch of these sites had seemingly large amounts of food stored there, which also were found burnt in the remains of these houses. So it was thought that these people wouldn't just, willingly burn all of their food stock, so they must have been accidents sort of thing. And it was argued that these houses basically had ovens in them. Well, I mean, they did have ovens in them, but the argument was that these ovens might lead to accidents occurring, and as a result, the house would catch fire and you would get the results that we see today. And these were two of the main arguments, you could say, for these fires starting accidentally. But in my opinion, the slightly more likely argument is that these fires were set on purpose. And we'll get into the reasons why these might have been set deliberately in just a little bit. But I want to mention a pretty cool experiment that was done, where they built basically replica models of these houses, trying to get as accurate as possible to how these houses might have looked, what they might have been built from, with clay walls, indoor ovens, thatched roofs, and then they accidentally lit a fire in these houses in the most likely way that a fire might have started, with the inside ovens. And then they let this fire burn untouched for over 30 hours. And when they then checked on the house, most of the stuff inside and of the house had been burnt up, the roof was burnt away, but most importantly to their conclusion, less than 1% of the clay that was used to build the house ended up being converted to ceramic. So from this experiment, it didn't seem likely that these accidental fires could have resulted in the large amounts of solid ceramic that we find in the remains of these houses. They theorized that in order for a fire to have been sustained for this long and to burn at as high a temperature as would have been needed to essentially, cook all of this clay, there would have needed to have been some extra fuel, extra wood, extra kindling stacked in and around the house before the fire was lit, essentially turning the houses deliberately into giant furnaces and producing the results that we see today. So if these ancient people did this, the next question obviously is why? Why would you destroy your own buildings, your own homes, your own possessions, your own resources? And that is a very good question why. One obvious theory comes from the idea of sacrifice. You know, people used to sacrifice honestly a lot worse than just their food. So that's one idea. Another theory was that this was in response to an early plague, you know, that spread out and ravaged this entire area. And so they figured out, you know, that burning the bodies, burning the infected, setting fire to the homes would essentially completely get rid of the plague and disinfect the entire area, which it's certainly a possibility. And the fact that these were done every X amount of years also kind of holds up, as plagues were known for, you know, kind of coming and going over the years. And if someone was infected and they're in their home, like, you don't really know what they've touched. The floor might be infected, their possessions might be. So maybe it was just safer for them to burn the person and burn all of their possessions and the entire home. Some other theories range from the houses being burnt to essentially secure and weatherproof them, you know, melt and bind the seals and the waterproofing sort of thing, to the fires being a result of warfare over the years. So, you know, invading people would come in, kill everyone, burn down the villages sort of thing. But for this one, we don't actually find really any evidence of death or fighting or warfare in this area at the times that the fires were lit. So that theory, I think, is a little weak. Another one says that, similar to the plague theory, if you don't want to go as far as, you know, plague, maybe they were used to cleanse and smoke out pests of some kind, whether that's mites, fleas, I don't know, wasps, ants. And another theory says that these fires were just a symbolic sending off, if you will, of the houses themselves. So once they were no longer in use, or maybe when the last occupant of the house died, these houses were set alight, had kind of like a house funeral, if you will, and then they were remade fresh by the new tenant, if you will. Quite a few theories on this one, and quite a few interesting ones to at least think about. And it is kind of wild to imagine what life might have been like for the people back then, and why these often huge areas would be set alight, burning communities and homes and villages, and, you know, what the mindset and culture and community might have been like. Hopefully we'll come up with more evidence and theories for this one, as it is, at least to me, super interesting. The Carroll A Deering was a ship found quite mysteriously abandoned off the coast of North Carolina in 1921. This was a fairly large sailing ship and was designed primarily to take cargo and people and, you know, shipments to and from place to place. It was built, deployed, and had been in use for only round about a year when in 1921 it planned to set sail to Brazil to deliver a large shipment of coal. Now, somewhat relevant to this story is that the captain of the ship was a man named William H. Merritt, who was honestly a pretty cool, pretty skillful, pretty well-liked captain, and his son, Cyril Merritt, was the first mate of the ship, so like second in command basically. So they left Virginia in 1920 loaded with all of this cargo and headed for Brazil, where they would eventually deliver it. But the captain, William H. Merritt, fell seriously ill while they were on their way to Brazil, and so they had to stop the ship, turn it around, and head back a little ways up to Delaware to drop off both the captain and his son. The company in charge of the shipment and of the ship then hired another captain and another first mate, and this is where things started to get a little bit uneasy. This new captain, Willis B. Wormel, seemed to not get along too well with the rest of the crew or with the new first mate, Charles B. McClellan, and normally first mates are more connected with the actual crew members. Like, you know, they're charged with the minor interactions, with seeing how the crew is doing, with talking to them, with disciplining them, etc. While the captain kind of manages everything from, you know, a bird's eye sort of view, because he's dealing with the crew members and the navigation and the engineers and all that sort of thing. But not only did Captain Wormel quite outwardly dislike a lot of the crew, he also didn't let McClellan, the first mate, do his job in managing them. They made it all the way down to Brazil, delivered the shipment, and here Wormel basically met up with another captain that he knew and just started to like badmouth the whole of his crew. And then after Brazil, they headed back up to North America, stopping in Barbados along the way. So when they stopped here, McClellan, the first mate, got really drunk at a bar and started complaining about Captain Wormel, how he was useless and rude, and he wouldn't even let him discipline his own crew members. He said that Wormel constantly wasn't trusting him with things, would just butt in and intervene and wouldn't let him do his job. And Wormel apparently had quite bad eyesight, so McLennan had to do a lot of the navigation as well. So he was basically doing most of the work while being shouted at all the time and without properly being able to control his crew. So yeah, as I said, one night he just got really drunk and said that he would, and I quote, get the captain before they got back to Norfolk, or before they got home to America, basically. And he was actually arrested drunk that night, but Wormel forgave him for the stuff that he said, bailed him out of jail, and brought him back on board to head back home to America. So that was it for that part. They left Barbados, headed back northwards, and were next spotted by a lightship, which is basically just like a ship that acts as a lighthouse, which is pretty cool. But they were spotted by this lightship near Cape Lookout off North Carolina. The lightship's keeper, Captain Jacobson, said that a tall, thin man with red hair and a foreign accent was speaking to him through a megaphone, and this man clearly wasn't Captain Wormel, and likely wasn't a mate. He said he shouted to him that the ship's anchors had been lost in a storm, and asked that the ship's company, G.D. Deering Company, be notified of this. Captain Jacobson apparently noted this message down, but he couldn't broadcast or send the message outwards, as his radio had apparently stopped working, which is unfortunate. Then the next day, another ship saw the Deering heading for this area called the Diamond Shoals, which is an area well known for causing shipwrecks due to its shallow waters and constantly shifting sand barriers or sandbars. And the whole area is known as the Graveyard of the Atlantic. Scary. And it is thought to be responsible for upwards of 600 shipwrecks over the years. So yeah, this is not the sort of place you want to be sailing towards. This ship that saw the Deering, however, didn't try to, alert or wave it down or anything, as they assumed that the ship and the captain knew of this area, as it wasn't exactly a secret, and just assumed that they knew what they were doing and that they would steer away from it eventually soon, or the crew would eventually spot the local lighthouse or the local Diamond Shoals light ship, which was stationed just out after the graveyard, kind of like a last warning for people sort of thing. But apparently none of these warnings actually took, as the ship was next seen just on the outer side of the Diamond Shoals, seemingly fully grounded and unmoving. The rescue crew weren't able to board the ship for another 3 days, mostly due to bad weather, and after boarding the Deering, what they found painted a wild story. This ship was apparently completely abandoned. The steering equipment was damaged, the wheel was shattered, the rudder was disengaged, the ship's logs and navigational equipment were missing, as was most of the crew's belongings and the 2 lifeboats. And the rescuers eventually tried to salvage and secure the ship, tried to wrestle it free of the ground, bring it back to shore, but it was more difficult and dangerous than it seemed. And so they decided to, I kid you not, blow it up with dynamite in order to prevent it being a hazard for other vessels. Now, what exactly happened to the crew and the captain and the ship is still a little unclear, but just a few months later, a message in a bottle turned up, found by a local fisherman, and this was just offshore North Carolina. He handed it into the police, and the message read as follows: Deering captured by oil-burning boat, something like chaser, taking off everything, handcuffing crew hiding all over ship, no chance to escape. Finder, please notify headquarters, Deering. The handwriting was identified as being likely from the ship's engineer, Henry Bates, and the bottle itself was proven to be manufactured in Brazil, where the ship had just made their last delivery. So, pretty eerie. Then it was also discovered that Captain Jacobson, who we mentioned earlier, the captain of the lightship, also spotted another ship after he spotted the Deering, and he said he tried to hail down the ship in order to relay the message that the Deering had given him, as his radio wasn't working. But this other ship didn't respond, didn't stop, and had actually hidden the name of their ship by hanging some cloth over the edge of the ship. So all of these things combined convinced everyone that there was some foul play afoot. But this message in the bottle was later found out to be a forgery, written and invented by the very same fisherman who found it. Apparently he was hoping for some publicity and fame of some kind, and that was basically as far as the investigation went. As I said, the ship was eventually just blown up. None of the crew members were ever found again, and theories about what might have happened ranged from the natural, like just bad weather, as there were apparently quite a few really bad hurricanes and storms in the area at the time, to a pirate attack, to a mutiny, so all the crew rebelling essentially against the captain, throwing him overboard, and then getting stuck in bad weather or these shallow waters, and then perhaps trying to take the lifeboats out to safety and just getting washed away into the ocean, never to be seen again. Then there are these slightly more obscure theories, like the Russians trying to board and hijack the ship, and the crew members purposefully destroying the ship's wheel and the navigational system, and potentially deliberately running it into the Diamond Shoals in order to stop the Russians boarding and taking it. To a really interesting theory, which I may cover later on in the Iceberg, but basically when the Deering was found, it had these two red distress signals lit on the top of the ship. And there was another boat, a steamboat, the Hewitt, that was known to have been in the area at the time and could have potentially seen these distress signals. The Hewitt itself, not long after this, completely vanished, and so this theory says that the Hewitt saw the distress signals, went to the Deering, rescued everyone on board, and then shortly after went down itself, taking with it its entire crew as well as the entire rescued crew of the Deering, which might explain why they were never found. So a few theories out there, no official explanation was ever given for this, and still to this day, this case, this ship, this captain and crew are part of one of the most mysterious maritime cases in modern history, the Chamberlin-Moulton planetesimal hypothesis. So this is a mostly debunked theory of how the planets in our solar system and in any solar system formed. It was proposed in 1905 by Thomas Chamberlin, who was a geologist, and Forrest Moulton, who was an astronomer. And the theory said that when a star forms, that's basically it. It just forms on its own and it has no planets around it. And for a collection of planets to form around it, it requires another passing star. And when this passing star comes by this other star, the gravity from it pulls a bunch of the star outwards. And this, some of the star that was pulled out, eventually breaks up and forms and rotates around the sun, forming planets. A reasonable hypothesis for the time, I guess. And a further idea was when this passing star pulled out some of the matter from the other star, the rotation of this star caused the matter to form sort of a spiral around the star. And so when looking out into space, we saw several spiral-armed objects, and they assumed with this theory that these were other stars going through this, planet creation process. We now know that these are indeed other galaxies, and this theory was later almost completely debunked when mathematicians determined that in order for matter, say, to fly out as far as Jupiter is, it would need enough momentum that it would just completely break out of the orbit of the sun altogether and exit the solar system. So yeah, a mostly debunked hypothesis, but still a fun one. Confederate gold refers to the large amount of gold kept by the Confederacy and seemingly never found again during the American Civil War. During the invasion of New Orleans by the North, the Confederates apparently moved millions of dollars worth of gold out to Columbus, Georgia. Then the Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard was ordered to take this gold from Columbus, and the bank manager refused. Beauregard pointed guns at him, and eventually he came over to his side. He handed the gold over to Beauregard, but what happened to the gold after this is more or less a mystery. There are a bunch of wild theories on this one, a few of which I might cover in my upcoming, well, I won't go into what my next iceberg will be, but I think you'll really like it. Some of the theories include the gold still being hidden somewhere, maybe in preparation for a future Confederate uprising, and these somewheres range from being put on a ship ship and sinking off the coast of Africa, to it being buried under Alcatraz prison, to even, as shown in the film Time Cop, to have been taken by a time traveler to the 20th century in order to pay off some criminals. So yeah, some wild ideas and theories out there. Some of them are quite clearly fiction, some of them are a little more reasonable, but the bottom line is nobody really knows where that gold went. Whether it was simply all used up for the war effort, or was captured and taken by the North after they won, or is still hiding somewhere out there, ready to be uncovered by some fortunate and very lucky treasure hunter. Who knows? The Copper Cauldrons of Siberian Valley. So these were these super interesting, mysterious copper cauldrons or structures protruding from the ground found in Siberia going back thousands of years. So for some background, this was in the Siberian taiga, which is this huge area of roughly like 4 million kilometers, and at least a few 100,000 square kilometers of that are completely uninhabited and unmapped, which is just a bonkers number. Like, compare this to the Yellowstone National Park, which is huge in its own right. Like, you could very easily get lost in that park, but that is only around 9,000 square kilometers. So yeah, 9,000 square kilometers compared to 4 million square kilometers. Just a huge area. But these rumors and legends of these giant copper cauldrons go all the way back to the times of the folklore in the local area, and the people in the immediate and surrounding areas were said to have called these Olgris, which I have no idea how to pronounce that. Might be Olgis, Olgris, Ogris, I have no idea. But it translates into cauldrons, and they were said to have been forged out of an unknown metal, were the color of copper but incredibly hard, and with very sharp edges. Going in or near these cauldrons would cause dizziness, nausea, sickness, and eventually death. And so the folks who wrote this lore declared this area as cursed and labeled it the Valley of Death, quite appropriately. They also noted that over time these cauldrons were slowly sinking into the ground and into the ice and snow, which might explain why these are apparently becoming harder and harder to find and locate. They were described as looking kind of like odd houses, smooth with an opening on the top that was either like circular or a dome. When you entered them, they would lead down a winding staircase and then branch off into other rooms all made of metal. They were said to be actually quite warm inside, and it was really only in the 18 and 1900s that encounters with these cauldrons started to be, written down and noted and documented, and some of these accounts were really quite interesting. One said that the vegetation around the cauldron was flourishing, all of the wildlife was brighter and bigger than the other wildlife out in the wilderness, and this might have been due to the heat produced by these things, or maybe to the minerals being, let off by these things. We're not really sure. And one group who went out there in the 1940s actually spent a night inside one of these cauldrons, and one member of the group who was, lying on their side sort of thing, ended up losing all of their hair and developed these wounds, these sores that would never heal on the side of their face that they were lying on. So this hints, at least to me, something like it being radioactive in a way. And as I said, this area is absolutely huge, and the landscape is always shifting and changing, and new plants and growths and trees growing and falling down. So it's really hard to map it out and to track people's eyewitnesses and experiences back to these certain cauldrons. So almost every expedition that went out there over the years found almost nothing and came back empty-handed. And eventually the last person, the last eyewitness to ever claim seeing one of these cauldrons died. So what do you logically do at this point? Well, you fly over the entire area in a motorized parachute, obviously. And that's exactly what this one group ended up doing. They flew over dozens of areas of suspected locations for these cauldrons and were constantly looking out for anything that might stick out. And they did end up spotting something strange and odd and circular in the wilderness. So they landed, they went up to the location of interest, and while they didn't find a cauldron, they did find a large circular pond. This was a strange, small, frozen pond that had a small, tiny island in its center. So they went to the center of the pond to inspect it further and deduced that this may very well have been a cauldron that, due to its heat, had slowly sunken into the ground, and also due to the heat, melted the ground and ice and snow around it, forming this liquid water which froze on the outer parts, and in the center on the island part, well, it was still liquid there. So the outer parts froze, the inner parts that were still close to the warm cauldron ended up staying as liquid water. It flooded the entire cauldron, and I mean, it is, to me at least, a little convincing and might explain why a lot of these are going out of sight. This idea was further reinforced by the fact that one of the crew members that night started to feel dizzy, faint, sick, couldn't eat, couldn't drink. So, you know, a lot of these symptoms that were kind of associated with these cauldrons. So partly due to this sickness, the expedition just decided to call it quits there and left back to civilization. Probably a wise decision, but they didn't come back empty-handed, as they did find a chunk of titanium ore, which apparently they could have sold the coordinates to say the Russians, for a fairly decent price. As, you know, where this titanium was found might indicate a spot where more rare metals and minerals could be found, and so could be mined and procured. So were these, as some people think, crashed UFOs, possibly emitting passive radiation still? Were they alien weapons installed in the ground in order to fire out at meteors and asteroids to, you know, protect our planet? Which is a very wild but interesting theory. Or were they just giant, deep pockets of ore, minerals, metals in an area that is, you know, kind of somewhat known for being rich in these resources, and just due to their weight and latent heat, ended up slowly melting down and sinking into the land below? It's a possibility, but who really knows? I do think all of the theories are pretty cool though. Cyber Anakin is a computer hacker that even as a teenager started to hack and leak tons of information, emails, passwords, addresses, and much more of mainly Russian news sites and Russian email providers in retaliation originally for Russia shooting down Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. Then he used all of this leaked info to track down a man who had been harassing female chess players, which is pretty noble. And he also arranged it so that this official North Korean website, which was a propaganda site, instead linked to this fake Twitter account that posted anti-North Korea photos, propaganda of its own, information, and insults towards Kim Jong-un. So pretty funny. He has done a bunch of these high-profile hackings over the years, and he seems to be quite good at them, especially since he's never been caught, and as such, his identity has never been revealed. Disrupted planets are planets that have either been disrupted or partially or completely destroyed by larger bodies like stars or other planets. These planets or bodies end up becoming destroyed, end up breaking into gas or dust or debris, and end up often orbiting their star, and this results in an uneven debris disk forming around the star and leading to these fluctuations in the brightness of the star. That's the theory anyway. Planet gets destroyed, forms dust, and this dust orbits the star, which partially and periodically blocks some of the light from that star. A cool little theory, but it's mostly theoretical, and so the confirmed cause for these fluctuations in brightness is still unconfirmed and is still somewhat a mystery. Dorothy Arnold was an American well-to-do woman who disappeared in New York in 1910. She was 25 years old, she was rich, her family was rich, her pet gerbil, if she had one, was rich. They had a lot of money. And she was out one day in December shopping for a dress. She bought some chocolates in a store, ran into a good friend of hers, and the friend described her as being completely fine and in good spirits. She then told her friend that she was planning on walking through Central Park and then was planning to head home. And that was the last time that she was ever seen. Her family initially wanted to keep this on the down low, keep this undercover sort of thing. And so instead of contacting the police, they hired a bunch of private investigators. And when that proved fruitless, they eventually did file a missing persons report with the police. But this was weeks after Dorothy had actually gone missing, not just hours or days. Like, the private investigators were all doing investigations of their own, they were doing interviews, they were collecting evidence for weeks, even up until months after Dorothy's disappearance. So because they took so long to actually tell the police about this, the family, after the disappearance came out, was, quite rightfully I think, heavily criticized by their friends and by the community. There were theories that she had been abducted or kidnapped, or that she had slipped while walking through the park, maybe banged her head and was now suffering from amnesia, or in fact actually died from the fall. But they checked a bunch of hospital and doctor records and couldn't really find any evidence for this one. There was no apparent ransom notes or demands of any kind, which, you'd expect there to be if you kidnapped the daughter of a super rich person. There were also theories that she felt quite sad and down after her writing work was rejected by a publisher, and she wrote of only seeing a long road ahead with no turning, and that mother would always think it was an accident, if you see what I mean. So, that is also a possibility. And there was another theory that said that Dorothy was secretly pregnant, and she was getting her pregnancy taken care of in an illegal clinic, and then she ended up dying from complications, and her body was disposed of, which is a horrible thing to think about. But this last theory became more widely accepted, you could say, when an illegal underground clinic was found and raided in Pennsylvania a few years later. And one of the doctors who worked there testified that Dorothy had actually been there and had actually died there, and that they had cremated her body in secret. So yeah, pretty messed up. But that is if you believe these doctors, of course, which a few of the investigators at the time didn't believe the doctors, and so that avenue was never really pursued too heavily. There were also apparent sightings and letters from Dorothy, but these again never really went anywhere, as the letters at the time were thought to be forgeries or pranks, and the sightings were determined not to be accurate or not to be Dorothy when they were followed up on. Her family did hold quite strongly to the belief that she was still alive and maybe might have, run away for some reason, possibly with a man, but the police at the time firmly believed that she was dead, and so they ended their investigations, and Dorothy was never found. And what happened to her on that fateful December day in 1910 will likely forever remain a mystery. And that is all we have time for. I really hope you enjoyed this episode, even though, as with the last episode, we're ending on a bit of a tragic case, but it is just the luck of the draw, and as always, thanks for watching.